All right, awesome. I think we'll go ahead and get started. So first of all, I want to thank everybody for joining this this month's session for VSMUG. Just a little background on us. Let me just go to the next slide here. This user group, we made it probably about the beginning of COVID, the Virtual System Management User Group. My name is Justin Shelfon. I'm the one that kind of started the group. We do have quite a few resources here that would be helpful for you guys if you're kind of new to the group. So first off, our website is vsmug.com. So from here, this is where you can see any sessions that we've had in the past. We're planning going forward to try to do about every 3 to 4 months, have a session. We do have some resources, like for example, you might see some example content, whether it's scripts or PowerShell, things like that. If you go to vsmug.com/GitHub, that will redirect you to any content that we have available to share for previous sessions. So for example, you'll find content for past sessions for any scripts or example content here. So check that maybe a day or two after the event, and anything from today that's relevant, we'll have that posted here. With another thing, let me include this link via an announcement. We will have a survey, so please feel free to open that up now, and then at the end of the session, would love to hear your feedback. Cool, so with that said, I think we'll go ahead and just jump right into the session. Johan, do you want to go ahead and take over?
I certainly will, and thank you for organizing this, and obviously thank you for having me. It's going to be a great fun few hours here. So I'm going to try and share my screen. And if you can kindly let me know if it looks reasonably okay. Yes, no? Can you see it okay?
Yep, I think that looks good. Everyone looked
Beautiful.
good for
Thank
the
you so much.
slide.
Yeah, so even it's kind of hard to see, but I actually dressed up for the occasion, put on a Mandalorian t-shirt, as you do on a user group meeting, right? Of course. So this is a type of session I've been presenting in various forms and capacities over quite many years now. And for the fun of it, I actually looked back and tried to find the very first ones I did on the topic. And I did find one eventually. And it was a blast from the past for sure. So I figured I should show this one as a start. Some of you may be actually old enough to remember this, but back in 2004 November, Microsoft released the very first feature pack for SMS 2003 back in the days. And that was allowed you to do OS deployment with SMS 2003. Before that, Microsoft basically recommended that, hey, use PowerQuest, use Ghost, do something else, but we don't have anything in SMS. And sure enough, I did a presentation on one of the early MMSs where we covered all the things related to that and their first attempt to create an enterprise deployment solution based on what's now ConfigMgr. So I just wanted to show this one for historical reasons. I know it's not Thursday, but it's still a throwback in time. So anyhow, back to the real topic at hand. This is going to be 45, 50-ish minute discussion, chat around what's going on behind the scenes when we do Windows 10 or Windows 11 deployments. Quite excited to see what will be of the Windows 11 release this fall. A lot of bits out there already that you can play with and poke around. And the good news is that if you already have a decent knowledge on Windows 10 deployment, you're in a very good shape for Windows 11 as well, because it's really not that different. In fact, a lot of the deployment things we do today are thanks to Windows Vista back in the old days. I even had a blog that I was very proud of at the time. I called it deployvista.com. I thought Vista would really take off, and obviously I was dead wrong on that part. But I kept it around as an archive just for the fun of it, because I tried to take it down one time, and I would get like hundreds of emails of people saying, "Oh, you cannot remove that. We still know those scripts and those bits and pieces that you had out there." So, all right, fine. It's an archive now. Still available. Other than that, my name is Johan. I absolutely love questions. I have actually asked my fellow participants in the user group meeting to every now and then interrupt me if there are good questions coming in, and I will also try to remember to ask for questions when I have the chance.
Yeah, and quick update on the questions. You will need to use the Q&A feature within the Teams live event. Unfortunately, due to the number of attendees, we were well above the limit for a normal Teams meeting. So please route any questions you have through the Q&A, and then we'll publish those and ask them to Johan throughout the session as well as after if there's time.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. So I've been doing OSD basically all my life. So while I might not have seen everything, I've seen a lot. So again, follow Justin's idea there, and if you have any questions, please post and I'll be happy to answer. So I think we should start here. Windows ADK has been around for a long time now. Was named AIK back in the Vista timeframe, but now it's called ADK. And every time you do a deployment in a deployment solution, MDT, ConfigMgr, whatever you have, there are tools from the ADK behind the scenes that are actually in play here. So for example, when you create a ConfigMgr boot image, it's not really a ConfigMgr boot image because they actually snatch it from the ADK and they add the ConfigMgr binaries to it. They replace it with their own custom shell, etc. And the same goes for MDT if you're using that for imaging. MDT does the same thing, borrows a copy from the ADK, and they add their scripts and binaries to it. And as fun as slide is, let's take a look instead. So here I have, just to do a comparison. On this particular machine here, I have installed Windows ADK for Windows 11 and Windows Server 2022. And when you install these kits, they show up in the usual locations. So you have a Windows Kits folder. It's still called 10, even though it's 11. Because if you look at the version number, all ADK versions, 10 or 11, they share the same version number. They always begin with 10.1. In difference to Windows 10 versions, which is 10.0, and funny enough, even if you open up a Windows 11 machine, this is one of the earlier builds, but it's still 10.0 as a versioning number. So they don't change that. It just keeps on growing up the build numbers rather than the actual major version numbers, which is good for scripting. It helps a little bit, but it can also be a tad confusing sometimes when you really need to different than two of them. But that's what's behind the scenes there. So if I go back to the installation folder here, 10, check the kits. Here's my deployment stuff. This is where I have Windows PE. This is where the boot images lives. This is the use the state migration tools that are being used when you're using refresh and replace scenarios. This is a tool that not too many folks are using, but it's there to help you create provisioning packages should you want to use them as part of your deployment solution. There is also the Systems Image Manager in play in the ADK, which can be used for authoring or edit unattended XML files. And then you have a ton of, well, tiny deployment tools in here. And for example, DISM, as you know, it's been part of Windows for a very long time. It's there to do online and offline servicing of things in the environment, mostly offline. But the thing is, the version of this is kind of interesting. And especially important if you're using newer versions of Windows. So the latest version of Windows 10 is, well, currently 21H1. The ADK that is used to service that one is still on 2004. There have been no new releases of ADK for that version. However, in my testing, it worked remarkably well to use Windows 11 ADKs to serve up both Windows 11 versions as well as Windows 10 versions. And I'm assuming that's going to be the standard going forward because you cannot have both installed at the same time. You have to pick and choose. And for example, for a ConfigMgr environment, it's kind of challenging to have to deal with multiple ADK versions. You have to basically install them in a separate box and create boot images there and then add them into ConfigMgr. It's just messy. and all the gory stuff in ConfigMgr to help us keep them up to date would be no longer existent. But the question is, why is it important to know that there is a DISM version in ADK? I will show you a great example. This is I think Server 2019 box, yeah. And if I open up a regular command prompt on this one, and I run DISM, you can see that the version of DISM is the one that came with Windows. So this is basically an 1809 type version, because Server 2019 is that version. But if I open up an imaging tools and command prompt and do the same thing, different version. So if you are on older versions of Windows and wanting to service and work with newer images than the one you're on, you actually have to, in some scenarios, make sure that you use the DISM version that comes with the ADK rather than the one that happens to come with Windows. An easy fix for this is, of course, well, simply always use a really, really late version of Windows to do your management and you're good. But if you are on older versions of Windows, make sure to pick the one that comes with the ADK. All right then. Other than that, this little tool is around to create ISO images should you want them. This is also similar to what ConfigMgr does when you create a boot image and what MDT does when they create a boot image. And then we have this little friend here, also a blast from the past, but multicast used to be a cool thing back in the days. A lot of schools and educations, they use it to deploy these large lab rooms they had with like 50, 100, sometimes 300 computers, and they needed to deploy them over lunch. They used multicast to do that. This is a little command line tool in here that actually allows you to push out any file through multicast. It never was supported really to do it, but it happened to work quite beautiful. So if you need to deploy a lot of like PhDs or a large lab setup for a lab, you can use this one to just blast them out through multicast. These days, well, we use peer-to-peer instead, because switches these days are actually quite effective in peering content. If you have a gigabit switch with, say, 24 ports, sure, each port may be limited to 1 gigabit, but when you have 24 clients connecting and they start to share content to each other, the backplane in that switch is actually capable of handling much more than that. So you can usually get content out to 24 machines in the same time as it would take to 2 or 3 of them without even having to involve multicast and all fun stuff that can affect an environment with. There have been customers experience that pain a lot. Peer-to-peer is easier because it doesn't require any, well, the ports need to actually be open in between the clients. I had one customer I worked with where they actually made every client their own little network and basically blocking all traffic in between clients. So it was a little bit tricky to do peer-to-peer in that environment. They had a better fix for it though. They bought a 10 gigabit pipe to all their locations. If you have that kind of money, sure, you can do that also, that works, but most people don't. So that was it behind the scenes. And in terms of deployment scenarios, nothing changed. This is the same for Windows 10 as they are for Windows 11. Most organizations or most technicians, if you work with imaging for more than 4 minutes of your life, you have done this scenario. You had a computer, you need to deploy a Windows machine to it in one way or another. The two in the middle are less commonly used, but they're still around. They're still supported. Both platforms, ConfigMgr, MDT, whatever. Refresh is usually there to, when you have a machine that is like a little bit broken, but not completely broken, you can use that scenario to kind of refresh it to a known state. And it's a fairly quick process. Everything happens locally. Data is being backed up and stored locally. It's quick. And some organizations are using this where they have machines to which they cannot do Inplace-upgrade. And Inplace-upgrade in this scenario is actually also servicing. Like when you are on Windows 10, you want to go to the next one. Or when you are on Windows 10, you want to go to Windows 11. And when you eventually will have to service Windows 11, still an in-place upgrade for some of these upgrades. But there are limitations to it. So as an example, back in the early days, this is, by the way, my blog, Deployment Research. This is where I post most of my things I stumble across in my life as a consultant, things that were supposed to work one way and turn out to work very different way. This is usually the kind of info that you find here. I have a post about upgrade limitations. So for example, if you want to use your own reference image still, you cannot do servicing with it. It has to be a clean image when you do servicing. If you accidentally at some point in time had a customer or yourself that decided that 32-bit was like, yay, this is where we're going. All our machines should be on 32-bit Windows because it's better. And then they realized down the road that, oops, we should probably have picked 64-bit. Also memory limitations and other fun things. You cannot upgrade from 32 to 64. It doesn't support it. But you can refresh from 32 to 64. So every refresh is sometimes used to basically work around limitations in the upgrade process so that you can come to a good known state and then continue to service that platform as time goes on. Replace, everybody does it. Well, most organizations does it, I should say. Most organizations, they have at least a tiny plan somewhere that says to replace hardware about every 4 or 5 years or something like that. And that means they will replace about 20 or 25% of their computers every year, meaning you have an old machine that is about to go out the window, you have a new machine coming in, and that's that scenario. Now, for these scenarios here, in general, we never run setup. We run an imaging tool like DISM or even good old ImageX that calls on DISM works. This one exclusively runs setup, except when an upgrade is not a real upgrade. Give you an example. This would be a real upgrade. Going from this version of Windows 10 to this version of Windows 10, that would be a real upgrade. Going from 1909 to 2004, keyboard is not behaving today. That would be a real upgrade. Going from, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, speaking of things not behaving, there's actually kind of an interesting question that just popped up in the chat, which was, so you mentioned some P2P stuff earlier with peer-to-peer communications. What's your kind of approach to how you enable things like that, but help secure those to prevent those people who are likely to misbehave and try and create lateral movements in an environment? What kind of security things do you recommend for that while still preserving the ability to do that with OSD?
What the heck happened there?
Okay, you're good now. I think you went muted maybe.
How long was I muted for?
10,
15 minutes?
Question. 10, 15 minutes. No, just after Jordan's question is all.
Okay, so branch cache has been part of Windows since Windows 7. And Microsoft has done extensive security testing of that platform. It's a built-in component and it gets the same love as all the other Windows components, except possibly printers, but and certificate services. But it's everything is encrypted. Content in the cache is encrypted. You cannot interfere with the network transfers in between. That content is validated as well. And it's being used so widely for a lot of different type of organizations. Every vertical you can think of is basically using it. So I'm not too worried about branch cache as part of Windows being insecure in any way. Quite the opposite. It's probably the most secure way where you actually can transfer content in between clients. So that's my take on it, at least. All right, hope that answered the question. I was talking about upgrades before, and in between what Windows version an upgrade is really an upgrade. So this is, of course, the same version. Microsoft decided at some point last year to change their naming standards once again for things, just to, I don't know, confuse us. So if I want to go from this version, this is no longer an upgrade. The end users may think it's an upgrade, but it's not. This is just a tiny enablement package. And when I say tiny, it's still 100 meg, but it's compared to a 4 gig WIM file, it's tiny. But the thing here, this process is at best, and I'm talking at best, a 30-minute experience, more likely up to the 1.5 hour range to do an upgrade like that. This is usually in the 2 to 3 minutes range. Basically, just a regular patch, you deploy it, reboot, you're done. And this is going forward. So if you go to 21H1, still an enablement package. If you go from 2004 to the upcoming 21H2, still a tiny package. This is going to be this way forever until Windows 10 eventually goes away. I have no idea. It has not been announced. But at least now, since almost 2 years back, we don't have to do servicing anymore. We just apply that tiny package and reboot and done. And that's kind of nice. Something that is also nice is that Windows 10, as you know, is released twice a year. Windows 11 is going to be released once a year. If it's going to be a full upgrade in between those years, I don't know. It's going to be a tiny enablement package, I don't know. But time will tell. But this is what we have right now, making it very, very easy for organizations to stick with Windows 10 if they don't have the hardware to run Windows 11 or cannot do the configurations needed to run Windows 11. Because this one here is supported 30 months. And it's very easy to go to that version. So you have time to consider and work on going from 10 to 11. For the fun of it, this is actually a slide I stole from Niehaus when we did a presentation of this topic last week, but we compared the command line switches in between Vista and 11, and of course they only have a subset available when you ask for them to get the real Vista or the real Windows 11 new switches. You actually have to go to the online documentation. But there are some that are quite known or useful to know about. For example, if you want to make sure that BitLocker is enforced during the entire upgrade process, there have been switches available since 1803 to actually try to be nice about it or say, heck no, we are doing this. You don't have an option. And go this one here. Diagnostics, something you can enable or disable to get that Shift F10 capability in Windows. Now, ConfigMgr, of course, overrides that anyway, because the ConfigMgr platform itself puts that tag file in that disables Shift F10 during imaging at all. So that's fun. These can be quite useful. They were added back in 2004. But if you do upgrades, you can actually force them to not bother about trying to find drivers on Windows Update. Now, ConfigMgr customers usually don't have that problem because ConfigMgr doesn't do driver updates per se, but Setup can. So you can tell Setup not to. This one is new for Windows 11, where you can accept the URL directly on the command line. Otherwise, you usually have that setting in the under10 file. And of course, all these settings that you have here, for the folks that are still using servicing plans in ConfigMgr, they can be put into a setup config file. And if you haven't seen this post by Adam, it's one of the best blog posts there is out there on how to use setup config INI in a large enterprise environment. Niall Brady also has some good topic on this one, but this is a good one. So I have the link in the slide deck again. Justin, how do you guys usually deal with slide decks? Do you upload them to the website?
Yeah, we'll upload it to the GitHub page for VSMUG. So if you just give me that, we'll have it posted by later this afternoon.
Beautiful. All right, will do. Thank you. Other than that, a lot of times when you do servicing, it really pays off to learn what's going on behind the scenes. And there have been plenty of sessions, even in older Ignites, on what's going on out there. And in my opinion, so far, even though it's outdated, the best session there is was from a young lady called Pallavi. She used to be with setup team, no longer there, but this show is still, or the session is still here. So if you go to the older Ignite and go to Ignite this classic in Atlanta, where we had the option to go to the Coca-Cola factory afterwards, that was pretty fun. Anyhow, sidebar. Dang, I missed these real world conferences. Maybe Brian will have some good news for us later. Who knows? So if you search for Pallavi and wait patiently, the page is refreshing here. Here we go. This is one of the best sessions I've seen in my life on what's going on in setup. And even though it's older, like 95% of this stuff is still valid. If you haven't seen the session, I highly recommend doing that. And as I usually say, if you have family and friends, invite them for a Friday movie night, then it's be a great show, great experience. If you have kids, they will love it as well, guaranteed. But there are some things, and I want to combine basically this one here with this one here, because I hate to break it to you guys, but there are things that can go wrong when you do upgrades. Just happens to be the case. And this is a good tool to help you figure out what's going on or what's wrong with the upgrade. Because an upgrade log file, the SetupDiag log file, can actually be quite big. It can be 700 kilobytes. It doesn't sound much, but if you think that's a log file, it's a lot of lines that you have to go through to read through it. And this tool helps you parse that log file or parsing that log file. Now, starting in Windows 10 2004, this one is now included. Prior to that, you have to download it directly from Microsoft, but it can be run standalone. So what I have here is a folder in which I have gathered a few failed deployments over the years, like this one.
Johan, I hate to interrupt you, but can you paste that link that you linked for that video in the chat? We have a few people asking for it.
I should be able to do that. I have done my copy and paste trainings. So here's the direct link. Chat is somewhere here.
I'll paste that for them. Thank you.
Beautiful. So I have a few failed deployments. And this particular tool, if I go to that folder, there's been 4 or 5 different versions of it. This is one of the older ones, but they all work the same. When you run the tool, you can run it either on the machine that failed, or you can specify an offline mode and simply point it to a folder where you have saved some log files or where someone has saved log files for you. So in this case, I'm going to run the tool, specify offline mode, and I'm simply going to point it to a folder to which I've saved these log files from the upgrade that was not happy. And let's see who can first spot what the issue might have been for this environment. I mean, there is nothing that this tool finds that you cannot find yourself, but it parses the log file pretty quick. So ladies and gentlemen, why do you think this one failed? Well, an educated guess would probably be that could be related to Trend Micro being on the box in a version that Windows 10 absolutely did not like. And that could very well have been the case. In this case, it wasn't. So obviously this was a trick question. The reason it failed for this customer was because they were using the wrong media. It was not because of trend. Let me explain what I mean with wrong media. So these particular log files, as you can see, they were dated back in March 2019. So I had a customer reach out in that time frame, early March. Back then, they were actually trying to go from this version of Windows to this version of Windows. But remember, time frame for this, March 2019. The reason it failed for them was because they used the original media for 1809, which was from November 2018. That had a bug in it. In the setup in the compatibility database, Microsoft fixed it right away because even though trend is not as common as it used to be, it's still a very common platform. So when the customer switched into eventually using still 1809, but using a media that was updated in March 2019, problem went away. Another more recent example was back in October last year, so October 2020. Some organizations were servicing Windows 10. They were going from 1809 because it was about to expire. Expired on my birthday, actually. That's pretty cool. May 11. I think they did that as a gift to me, Microsoft. Just a thought. Anyhow, organizations were upgrading from either that version or to newer versions of Windows. And after upgrading, they realized that every single certificate was gone from the machine. Every single cert removed. And especially in working from home type times, that's not good. Because certificate is usually what you use to be enabled to establish that VPN connection and other connections to the office. So a lot of organizations was a bit surprised about that one. But it didn't fail for everyone. It only failed for someone. And the reason it failed for a few people was because when they were doing their upgrades, they were using media that was from September 2020. And they were upgrading machines that even though they were an older OS, they were patched with the October patch. So from a patch level, the machine was newer than the media they were deploying. And that's caused the problem. Because Microsoft, and this goes for many, many organizations, they are good at many things, but they royally, royally suck at time traveling. All of them. It's hard for an organization to test a September media against a patch that is 1 month or several months in the future. It's just tricky. It's kind of easier to test the media that is from October to a patch that is released in October, or even better, a newer media, whatever you have access to. But to summarize this very short, when you guys do servicing, make sure you use an updated media. And before Microsoft realized this themselves and started to publish media every month, we had to rely on community solutions like OSD Builder or WinWitch or your own custom scripting to create these better medias. But these days, you can simply go ahead and download them directly from Microsoft every month. So that's a good change. But bottom line, when you do servicing, I recommend use the best media you can possibly find because it will remove some of the failures that you might see during servicing.
Johan, quick question before you go on to the next session. It's from Fahid Shaheen in the chat. He kind of wants to know what's your insight about being able to orchestrate a rollback of Windows 10 using ConfigMgr. What would you do? What are the options?
So setup itself has a rollback option. So if you want to have the sequence trigger it, there are some sections for it, but they have not been working as expected over time. I think it was Gary that put together a really nice post about it. Let's see if I can find that one real quick for you. Yes, he does. I found his tweet, and obviously if you guys are not on Twitter, you should be on Twitter. This is how we get updates. This is an article that explains how this process works in ConfigMgr. So I'm going to put that in the chat as well. And then I figured you guys can help sharing that one. All right. Any other good questions on the topic or while we're here?
Yeah, we got one for, is the only enablement prereq to be on 20H1? I assume you can push enablement from 1809 to 20H1. You did discuss that earlier, but I don't remember the detail to be able to answer that.
Oh, to use the sort of the new ones, you have to be on 2004.
That's right.
If you're going from everything older, it's gonna be a full upgrade until you get on whatever version you're upgrading to, and then you can continue to do enablement packages for Windows 10. Oh, yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
All right. So that was about updating media. Use the latest one. Microsoft actually eventually went about and documented this entire process and exactly what needed to be done. Quite many steps and providing script examples and whatnot in obviously the large portion of PowerShell scripts. So should you really want to, yeah, go ahead. You can write your own scripts to do it, or you can just download the latest media. The latter one is a little bit quicker, to say the least. This one is kind of interesting, I think. Why should you bother about using dynamic updates? Well, if you use an already updated media, you don't have to. But in ConfigMgr, there used to be 2 options to do upgrades. Now there are 3 options to really make things confusing. But it used to be that in ConfigMgr, you would pick between using sequences to drive the upgrade, or you will use servicing plans to do your upgrades. Servicing plans, we're using ESD files, slightly smaller, faster to download, and they're using the setup config file that I mentioned before to do any type of customizations. Whereas sequences would basically run setup.exe from a Vim file, from a ISO that you downloaded from Microsoft, basically, and do the processes there. Now, in sequences, you now have a second option to deal with that particular media. So I've picked one of my upgrade sequences and go to the step that actually applies the upgrade. There is an option now to select to use a feature update rather than an upgrade package. And this was introduced in 2103, so it's fairly fresh. And the interesting part with these ESD files, if you think they are updated monthly, you're wrong. It's usually once, twice, maybe 3 times per year if it has been a major issue somewhere. So for example, after the October 2020 incident, sure enough, they showed up in the media eventually from November there for ESD files, but they are older. So if you insist on using those, then you kind of have to use dynamic update. So you get the latest bits down before the upgrade kicks in. And that's applicable for both this and also for servicing plans if you're going that route. I actually spent some time just for the fun of it comparing deployment speeds for different type of scenarios, as you do. So this was back in was still winter in Chicago, but it was earlier this year. I had a few different images. I have an ESD file that I was playing with. I had a default Microsoft image that I downloaded, and I had an image that I built with David Segura as OSD builder. So 3 different scenarios here. And then I simply quit myself with a stopwatch, well, PowerShell, but stopwatch nonetheless, and timed it. How long did it take to deploy things using different types of media? And more interesting, how much network traffic was used? And sure enough, the ESD files that are heavily compressed was only 3.3 gigs. And then you had to add at least half a gig for dynamic updates. But it all ended up in total of about 3.8. Whereas the default Microsoft media, well, I don't really have that option, it was 5 gigs. And the builder media was 4.5. The interesting thing I thought was the actual time it took to do it. Because of the extra encryption and decryption of the package, it actually took a little bit longer, at least when I did the test, to do the ESD files. And also to download and get the dynamic updates, of course. But that's basically the difference. So just make sure that if you are not using regular sequences, old school, make sure you enable dynamic updates for those. I recommend these days in general is not so much which method you select and do. Put in the work for testing and put in the scripting that is required of things you need to do prior deployment, during deployment, and after deployment, because there will be times when you need to do that. So for example, these days, for most of the customers that I work with, we use sequences, but we use 2 of them. We will use one sequence that does validation only, that we push out in advance, checks that everything is good to go. We also use the pre-cache content, and machine that passes that validation will get automatically added to another collection, and those we deploy the real upgrade to. Because there is no point to deploy an upgrade if we already know it's going to fail. But a validation we can push out silently in the background, no progress bar, no nothing, and we can just collect the result. But that's called like a phased approach, where you basically split up the process in at least 2 steps. Some organizations, they have more steps than that, but at least 2 instead of going in a single go. If you're using servicing plans, you do the same thing in scripting. You create compliance items, compliance baselines, or configuration items and compliance baselines. You deploy them first to make sure that the machine is ready and the setup config file is in place, have all the bits it needs and whatnot, and then we start the upgrade. And then we have another item that fixes everything that the upgrade possibly broke. So, I mean, setup does have very, very limited. See if I kept that slide somewhere here. Maybe I removed it. There are options in setup, to do stuff after and before upgrades. But in general, I recommend leveraging the ConfigMgr platform to do the same thing because you get better control of it. Organizations that are using this, calling these batch files, they are usually just calling them to call a PowerShell script that does the same thing. So anyway, we ended up with PowerShell nonetheless. Log files, of course, I showed you the SetupDiag tool. Use Inplace to open that one as well, even though it's not formatted ConfigMgr style. It actually works very well to use Inplace to read those log files also, in addition to use SetupDiag to parse it. Yes, dynamic update, talked about media. Any shiny questions coming in?
There are actually quite a few. I don't know if you can see the Q&A section, but we've got questions. There was one that recently just came in on those results that you had for the time-based things that it took. Was that on an SSD or HDD?
That was SSD only. I don't use mechanical disks anymore, ever. Not going to happen.
We do have one question from Anonymous. It doesn't sound like they're in a good situation. So they're all on Windows 10, 15, 11. how would you go about tackling this? I think it's like a media upgrade from that point, right?
I mean, my core recommendation would probably be hit that F12 button and just wipe them fresh. Technically, you can still find media. You might get away with only 3 upgrades. So you would go from 15.11 to maybe a 16.07, and then from that one to an 18.09, and maybe from that one to a recent build, but you cannot go in one go. It simply won't work.
Oh, that's a good point. I didn't even think about that. They would have to do it in several stages of the upgrade path.
It will still work. It's going to be an extremely painful process. You basically take a 6-year journey and compress it into like 2 weeks of upgrade. But yeah, both way works. It's not like setup accidentally changed just because 2 years later, but
here's
they
one
have to be disconnected from internet because you don't get any updates at all. That's just okay.
Here's one that might be good for you, Johan. What about using Dart to support a troubleshooting scenario of real time? Is there a fancy way to do that?
For bare metal builds, yes. In place upgrades, no. You have to use VNC or something if you want to do things during the actual that portion of the setup, or just remote tools while we are in the downloadable phase. But I do have a blog post on how to enable Dart, what I call the real way. I'm not too happy how the ConfigMgr team ended up. It's not really their fault either. It was the MDT implementation that did it. Anyhow, if you're going to add Dart, use this post. It starts. You can remote into the machine even before you even, for example, type in a password.
You want to link that out here, and we can link that for them?
For a small fee, I'll be happy to.
We also have a few people asking if it's possible for you to share that validation task sequence that you have.
I should be able to, yes. Might take me a little bit to export it and make sure I don't have any stupid things. I usually post most of my stuff on, that was BitLocker sequences. Yeah, I can make that happen. I will do it after the meeting. I'm going to just make a note real quick about it.
Yeah, we'll post the XML for the sequence in the GitHub repo.
Beautiful.
There is one more. I don't know if it's been asked already, because
I have one actually here. We have a newsletter that goes out from the blog. If you sign up to that one, you get the 76-page Windows deployment guide. It has the steps needed on how to set that up with multiple sequences, validation, queries, collections, and all that fun stuff. So just a shameless plug.
Here's another one.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry about that.
No, I was just saying, speaking of other shameless plugs, if you do want to learn more, we recently launched a training academy where we have a lot of different trainings available. So if you're interested in that, I'll be happy to see you on that one. So yeah, back to questions.
Yeah, so the next one I'm seeing is, I know this is focused heavily on ConfigMgr, but do you believe the feature update deployment method for Endpoint Manager is a good option for upgrading the system to the most recent builds, or is it still best for co-managed systems to deploy with task sequences?
No, I mean, there are a lot of organizations who are using servicing plans in general and are happy with that. There is no workload specific for imaging, at least not yet. In that space, you can still leverage these scenarios. Answer the question.
I think so.
How are you doing on content, Johan? Was that pretty much wrapping it up, or do you have some anything else.
Oh, but I'll be happy to take any questions if you want.
Cool. Let me take a look at what we have here.
I know you guys usually have a little bit of a break in between the sessions to allow people to, well, take a break.
Yeah, so here's one. If I re-image a computer rather than using an in-place upgrade, is there a way to utilize USMT tools to save user data?
Yeah, you can treat it as either a refresh and replace, and both those scenarios are using the user state migration tool. And we even had customers who are using the replace scenario for the same computer, like when they were having a third-party disk encryption or something that was really hard to do a refresh. So they will back up the old computer, store the backup on the state migration point, and then do a bare metal of the machine and restore the backup to the same computer. So you do have options there available for both those scenarios. The only time you shouldn't do a refresh is when you're lacking a one key component, and that is happiness. If you're not happy with what's on the box currently, or what you have in that scenario and want to back up stuff, a replace could be a good thing to basically put it back into a different state, or simply deploy it fresh. That's also an option.
So here's one. So how do you, it's basically, it sounds like it's troubleshooting a failed in-place upgrade when SetupDiag is pretty generic or irrelevant. Are there any tools to help with that?
That actually, not really per se. What I found very useful is actually go back into the log file itself and not just looking at the actual error, but also to the events leading up to that error in the log file, because that SetupDiag won't tell you what happened before. It will only tell you what the failure was. So that is sometimes helpful. Other than that, learning the processes behind the scenes is very valuable. Knowing what was supposed to happen when you do different things, it often allows you to troubleshoot in the right place at the right time.
Cool. No, I think that's the majority of questions. There are some that are still in the new that we haven't reviewed yet, Johan. So maybe during the break between the sessions, if you just want to kind of check out some of those in the chat, maybe you could answer some of those just typing via the chat as well. Does that sound good?
We'll be happy to.
Okay, cool. Well, let me take over the presentation, and I'll go ahead and just switch over to a stopwatch. So we'll do a 4-minute break between sessions just for bio break. And when we come back, we have Adam Metzler from the ConfigMgr product group to just show us some cool things with Support Center, as well as just a variety of other things that he has on his mind. So that should be an awesome session.
Sounds good. Thank you, guys.